That'd be great.
Fabulous. Thanks, Max, and thanks to the Safe System Solutions team for partnering with us on this and navigating the IT logistics, which we had a little late. Thanks, Marissa. Great to have you all here, and really excited to see this component of the program moving along so well. For those of you that don't know me or AGF, let me just give you a little quick introduction. So the Amy Gillett Foundation is the peak cycling safety advocacy organisation in Australia. We were awarded a $6 million Australian government grant called Safe Roads for Safe Systems, which we have now abbreviated to Safe Cycling just for ease. And if you want to head along to safecycling.org.au, there's a whole lot of content there that you can see that will continue to evolve as we move through the program. The program is running until the 30th of June next year. The overall vision of the program is to improve the return on investment from the investment that goes into local roads funding. And obviously that's got a lot to do with what you're going to work through with Safe System Solutions and their training over the next few modules. The program itself at a delivery level has two main arms. Stream 1 is an upskilling and collaboration arm, which this work sits within, and Stream 2 is a data and mapping arm, which is all about putting the information at the fingertips of those that are working to deliver safe cycling infrastructure around the country, being able to have that information be interrogated to really pinpoint where the limited investment that's available can go in to make the greatest leaps forward around that safe infrastructure. I'm the program lead, so if you need to reach out to us, we're really looking to expand the Amy Gillett Foundation's networks through the process of the program. We've got an exciting launch coming up on the 16th of October at Parliament House for a thing called Bike Spot, which you can all spread through your networks, which is about pinpointing locations around Australia's road network where people feel unsafe. So lots of ways to get engaged with the program. Thank you all for participating in Module 1, and I'll hand over to Max to take it further from here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for your time, and thanks to the Amy Gillett Foundation, of course. It's an exciting partnership, and we're very privileged to be running this with you and getting this training out to all these wonderful practitioners. So thanks to the Amy Gillett Foundation. Thanks to everyone for logging on. We do have a few administration things that I'd just like to go through just at the start of today's module, and then we'll get stuck into some content. If you have any issues with your Zoom webinar or anything like that, don't stress. All of this is recorded. So these webinars are recorded. After each session, we upload them to our learning management system, our LMS. We'll go through that in a bit more detail at the end of today's slides, just so you can see what that looks like. And our moderation today will be completed by Marissa, if you'd like to do a little introduction.
Yes, thanks, Max, and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to have you all on board for Module 1 today. I am a coordinator here in the training team at Safe System Solutions. You probably would have received a bunch of emails from myself or perhaps Sam or any one of us in the team already. So if you do have any issues at all, any questions in regards to any of the task work or any issues logging on to the LMS, please shoot us an email at training@safesystemsolutions.com.au. If you can't make a session or if you have any technical issues, please, just let us know. If you do have any IT issues during the session, the best thing is just to log out and log back into the webinar. That usually seems to solve most of the problems, or sometimes a quick reboot. And as Max mentioned, no stress if you happen to miss out any of the content. Everything is recorded, so it's available, and it will be available for you to watch back. During the session, we would love your participation and encourage all of your chat and questions. If you would like to ask Max a question, we do have the Q&A function probably somewhere there on the bottom of your screen. You can see you can see on the slide there, as thank you, Max, for the arrow. Pop your questions into the chat. We have the beautiful Ilsa in the background here, who will be assisting us in answering all of your questions and or throwing over to Max to answer if needed. We do have the general chat function also. Please feel free to use the chat to comment on any of the content that Max is talking about today. If you'd like to have any general chit chat with each other, the chat is there for you to use. But if you do have any particular questions you'd like answered, pop them into the chat. Pop them into the Q&A, and we can sort of keep track of your questions there. As mentioned, if any of your tech fails, all of the slides are available on the learning management system for you to refer back to. Or you're also welcome to pop any questions you have to us panelists into the chat there. You can see in the chat, you can type to hosts and panelists, or you can chat to everyone also. So we do encourage you to chat to everybody, but if you do have a specific question for myself, you're welcome to chat to just me under hosts and panelists. What else can I tell you? I think I've covered that, Max.
Beautiful. Well done. Thank you very much, Marissa. And we might also get an introduction now from our other colleague, Ilsa.
Hello, everybody. As Dave said, my name is Ilsa. I am with Sept System Solutions as well. I am a project engineer in the design team, and I'm excited to be joining you guys today. And I will be answering some questions in the chat, as well as, talking to Max through some of those bigger questions. Yeah, exciting.
Fantastic. And what's your experience with cycling, Ilsa?
I ride my bike every day to work. I don't have a car, so I've really enjoyed riding around Melbourne. I love the upfield line. That is my turf. So really passionate about cycling and safety. And I think it's one of those things that once you notice some of those things, you can't unsee it. So it's a really exciting course, and really good conversations happen. So yeah, looking forward to all of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Ilsa. My name is Max McArdle, for those that I haven't met. I am Senior Engineer or Engineering Operations Manager at Sept System Solutions, and very passionate about cycling infrastructure. I've been involved in the space for many years now, and regularly provide state government, local government areas specialist advice relating to cycling infrastructure. So things like reviewing designs or policy work, even development of guidelines and things like that to ensure we've got the safest outcomes for cyclists. A lot of what we cover in these modules is amalgamation of a variety of jurisdictions across Australia. So we're not just focusing on what is applicable to Victoria or to Queensland or Western Australia. Instead, we've had a global look at a variety of jurisdictions, and we've kind of picked out what we would consider best practice that is being achieved kind of across the nation. So just as a heads up, you will see a variety of different resources, and we provide all those resources as well on our learning management system. So you'll have access to all of them in case you need to check anything yourself at a later date. Our principal engineer, Ken Beer, he will be joining us next week. This week, he is presenting at the Australasian College of Road Safety Conference up in Cairns. So he's unfortunately an apology for these modules, but we do have Ilsa here to help with the technical queries that come through. But yeah, Ken was pivotal in helping to develop and design this course. Both the content that is within here, he's peer reviewed everything, as well as the course work. So there are some quizzes and things like that just to ensure that all participants are able to demonstrate their new learning. So Ken, for those that haven't met, Principal Engineer at Sept System Solutions. already touched on the learning management system. If you haven't received an email to get stuck into that, please reach out to Marissa and the training team. So it's just training@safesystemsolutions.com.au. It's very important that you have all those details, because that's where all of our information is stored and how we manage all things to do with this course. So please reach out if you are unable to access that. Now, to ensure that we do have your full engagement during these modules, we include this little fellow here. We call him Wally the Wombat. And Wally is dotted randomly throughout today's module. And it'll just be your job to count or take a tally of how many times do you spot Wally. He won't always be as big as that, but you will see him dotted around. There will be a quiz question, which will just be, how many Wallies did you spot? So that's kind of how we're trying to tie in this idea of making sure that we've got eyes on the presentation and not, trying to work on too many emails in the background or doing any design work or anything like that. So hopefully we can just get your attention just for these module webinars. This one is not included in the count, so you're currently at 0 Wallies, okay? We do have some minimum benchmark requirements for competency in order to actually pass this course. So it's not just a matter of sitting here and you'll get your certificate. We do require all participants attend all the webinars. So we've got a record of people that attend, as well as if you do have to drop out of a session to pick up the kids or, do whatever you need to do, that's completely fine. But we just ask that you follow up that session via the LMS on the webinar recording. We also require a minimum of 80% for all of our coursework. So there's 2 assignments, 2 quizzes, and they require an 80% mark on each or higher. Now, that may sound quite high. It's certainly a lot higher than what I was required to do when I was at university. But the reason we have that benchmark is just to give us confidence that we have adequately shared our learnings within this space. We're not made it an insurmountable, challenging assignments and quizzes or anything like that. All the content that is within the slides, you can reference, and then you'll be able to use that information when you're doing the coursework. We do also allow up to 3 attempts for the coursework. So if you haven't met that benchmark on your first go, please reach out to the training team, come directly to myself or to Ilsa. Give us a call, and we can provide that one-on-one coaching. We certainly don't want to be failing anyone within this space. We see that as a failure upon ourselves, as being able to succinctly deliver training materials if we are failing any participants. So we do encourage you, if you are struggling with any of the content, just please do reach out. I do have a poll to get things started, just to glean a bit of information about participants here. So Marissa, if you don't mind launching the first poll of the day.
Sure. Can you say that one, Max?
Yes. So hopefully that's come up on your screen. For those who haven't used polls before, you can move the box around, put it to a different screen. If it's blocking the presentation, just do whatever you need to do. The question is, please rate your level of cycling infrastructure knowledge. And there's 4 options, which is I'm not aware, I'm aware but don't know much, I'm knowledgeable, or very knowledgeable. I'll give you a moment just to fill that in. If it hasn't come up on your screen, every now and then we get some participants who have like firewall issues and their IT don't allow these polls. So you can just pop your answer in the chat, how you would rate your skill set. You're not being marked on this at all. It's just a matter of curiosity. So don't feel too stressed if you're not 100% sure. All right. We can start talking about some cycling topics now, and we'll get stuck into the agenda. Before we do, actually, I did just want to pause for a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are gathered today. And they are varied lands. We are streaming multiple locations across Australia. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging from all of those differing lands. I'm on Bunurong land today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians. Today's agenda, we will be focusing on all of the off-road cycling facilities. So when we are thinking about cycling infrastructure, generally it's most comfortable for cyclists if we can bring them away from the carriageway environment altogether and provide off-road paths, okay? Generally, they're shared paths, meaning it's pedestrians and cyclists sharing the one network. In terms of the shared path design, we'll have a chat through common characteristics of these, things like the path width, the gradients, hazards adjacent to the shared path, things like sightline requirements and fencing. We'll also talk about, well, what do we do when this off-road facility does cross over a carriageway or a road? How do we provide that awareness to cyclists and also to motorists? How do we deal with the conflict point there? So we'll get stuck into cyclist priority treatments, things like bollards, and also acknowledge the need to remember that we have to fulfill any DDA requirements. Finally, last little module for the day, sub-module, would be the shared path, crossing other shared paths. So bit of content to get stuck into today, but I encourage you to please jot any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry, and share any of your own experiences in the chat for other peers to see. And yeah, just be interesting to hear if you've got any sites that you can find that is relevant to these images, and always good to share your own experiences. Okay, first example here. Oh, sorry, Marissa.
No, that's okay. I'm just going to end the poll there. Max?
Excellent.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, so the first image I've got here is actually not of a shared path per se. We've got an exclusive bicycle path. So the way that this is set up or has been designed is this facility here where we can see the two cyclists is a designated exclusive bicycle facility. So it's only meant to cater for cyclists. Pedestrians are actually given the space adjacent the esplanade there, where it's much wider and, you know, closer to the waterfront, which is quite lovely. But I think it's a really important consideration here. This is a very busy commuter route. This is in Melbourne. This route goes into the city itself. And if in this instance there was one shared facility where pedestrians and cyclists are required to commingle and share, it quickly becomes quite uncomfortable. It's probably not all that surprising to hear. If you've got lots of volumes of pedestrians, lots of volumes of cyclists, just the speed differential is quite uncomfortable if you're a pedestrian or if you're a cyclist, because cyclists tend to end up weaving in and out of pedestrian traffic. So really good example here of where, you know, this planning has come into place where, while we acknowledge that this is a CBD area, you've got cyclists here that are likely want to be traveling at speed. So let's provide a facility there that's purely for them, and pedestrians can have a separated facility. Now, obviously in the real world, you do get pedestrians that, you know, use and occupy this space, but the intent of this is to have it solely as a bicycle facility. This diagram has been sourced from the Austroads Guide to Road Design, Part 6A. For those interested, if you ever need to check where any of these figures or tables come from, we do provide the source at the bottom of the screen, so you can copy these into your own reports or look them up just to get further information. What this is saying here is along the y-axis, we've got the number of volumes of pedestrians, which is measured at a two-way per peak hour volume. And along the x-axis, we have got the number of cyclists two-way per peak hour as well. So pedestrians and cyclists. I'll quickly just go to the extremity of this graph, and basically where you've got very, very high cyclist numbers all the way to the right of the graph and very high pedestrians numbers all the way to the top, you'd be in this little quadrant here, which this graph is suggesting to investigate a 4-meter bike path and a 4-meter footpath. So it's not saying do a shared path, it's saying do separate facilities, much like what we saw in that first slide, that prior slide there. That's the main takeaway that you can get from this graph. We don't always need to be sharing paths, because we acknowledge that these two different users, they have different experiences, they travel at different speeds. Pedestrians may deliberately want to meander and take a very slow, gradual journey. Cyclists may want to get from A to B as quickly as possible. So where you do have high volumes of either or of these users, having that separation is a really good starting point, if it's indeed possible. Your shared path here is all this in the blue, and as you can see, it's relatively lower numbers where that could be seen as appropriate. Another way that you may have seen the shared path width described, this is taken out of a Victorian document, but also from the Austroads Guide as well. It's this idea of defining what is the strategic intent of the shared path. The kind of issue with this definition is there's really not clear demarcation as what the difference between a local access, what a regional, and what a recreational path is. So you don't really have clear metrics as to say, okay, this path that I'm working on, it's definitely categorized as a regional path. It's not quite as easy to measure as that. I do encourage you just to flick through and you can review yourself the types of definitions that they've got in there, but you'll see it is generally quite vague. But the idea is a local access path would not be considered to have a throughput of cyclist activity. It's going to provide probably residential access. I guess you could think of it as similar to local streets. It's got that same kind of feeling to it. The image that is actually shown there, that has got a shared path width of 2 meters. Now, I strongly encourage you to, although that is listed as a minimum width, we should never be aiming for minimum widths. In fact, the minimum width, it just really does not satisfy the needs of either pedestrians or cyclists. You can see that these two people walking side by side here, there's no room at all for a cyclist to be able to pass them, to be able to cross over them, or what, it's just it's not comfortable for pedestrians or cyclists. This is a very, very narrow space. So not really big fan of using the minimums. A regional path, this middle image here, the kind of definition that's provided is more about, it's got a higher cycling movement function. Within Victoria, we've got these strategic cycling corridor maps and things like that, which can tell you exactly what type of route belongs where, but not all jurisdictions have this type of terminology already identified within their networks. But a regional path would be more, it does have more of a throughput of traffic. So this would be more arterial if I were to use road network terminology. A recreational path, once again, the split here between regional is pretty loose. The way that it is worded within the Austroads Guide is it's likely that the adjacent land use may have attractions like playgrounds and things like that. So you may have a greater diversity in users there. You could have, parents with their prams, school children riding there and things like that. But as I said, take all of these definitions with a grain of salt because they're not clearly defined and demarcated. So can be used as a starting point, but not necessarily it's going to, be able to solve which width to choose. When we are talking about the gradient, we're generally thinking about the uphill gradient, so how comfortable it is for a cyclist to ride uphill. Personally, myself, I'm a regular cyclist, and I tend to avoid routes that have lots of hills just because I don't have the stamina for it. And I'd go out of my way. I'd do a detour to avoid a really steep section. And this graph here is just illustrates that exact sentiment, but applies some actual metrics. So you can measure, well, what would be a reasonable expectation for cyclists to be able to travel at? What kind of steepness would be reasonable, and for how long can we maintain that? So the y-axis is the length of the gradient there, and along the x-axis we've got the gradient percent. So I'll just pick out an example just to show you. So the higher the gradient, the steeper it is. So I'll just pick 10% as an example. And, if I was considering what would be a desirable length of that gradient, I'd be looking at that solid line here, which is about there. My pen's stuffing up a little bit. And if I drew that along here, you can see it's about 10 meters. So all this graph is trying to say is, if you've got a really steep section, it's at 10%, try and keep that shared path length to 10 meters or below. Otherwise, it's just not going to be desirable for cyclists, and they may choose to ride elsewhere or dismount or not use the facility at all. So that's the theory behind where this graph has come about. And it can be useful for those spot checks, particularly if you're doing any shared paths that have to cross kind of underneath roads, or it has to go up over an overpass or things like that, and you do require ramps and things like that. That's exactly where this graph can come in handy, just to check that the gradients that you're providing do kind of fit in with what would be reasonably expected for cyclists. So as I mentioned, when we do talk about the gradients, we tend to think of the uphill gradient, but I'll put this question, I'll open it up to the chat. Are there any considerations that you think would be worth thinking about for the downhill gradient? So for this instance, imagine if you were a cyclist at this point here, traveling down this ramp here. What do you think are some of the risks that you'd need to consider as part of, if you were designing an upgrade at this location? I'll give you 30 seconds just to have a think about that.
A lot of speed discussion.
Speed, yes.
Skid resistance, stopping distance, visibility, sightlines. Pedestrian conflict points. A lot of conflict. Yep, speed conflicts.
All right. Well, certainly lots of answers there coming through, Ilsa.
Yeah.
There's lots of good answers there, and we do like to give out prizes. So I'll probably give out a prize to the first person that mentioned the conflict point at the bottom of this ramp here. So either Ilse or Marissa, I'll let you have a flick through the chat and see who you can find there. But all of those answers are very relevant. Yeah, the surface conditions and the skid resistance there.
I think that maybe it was Emily with
Emily.
Pedestrians at the bottom.
No, we'll go for that. No worries. Well done, Emily. And yeah, so just relating to the speed of the cyclist, just using good old-fashioned gravity, if you were just to release yourself, not using your brakes and go down this, you could quite comfortably be traveling at 25. There's a lot of clapping going on. Well done, Emily. You've got a lot of friends. You could comfortably be traveling at, say, 20, 25 kilometers per hour by the time you reach the bottom of that ramp. So fairly, fast speeds there. And this clapping is really throwing me off. So that it's relatively high speeds, for a cyclist. And some cyclists may not be able to, they may not be comfortable with that, or they may not be used to traveling at those relatively high speeds. And if we look down at the bottom of this ramp, so if we have a look at the left-hand image, there is an adjacent path that connects right about there. The way that this railing is set up is it completely blocks that. So we have very, very poor sight lines of the adjacent path here. So two things at play there. Poor sight distance, where the conflict point is, and high speeds where the conflict point is. So we really want to manage that interaction there. So what we could do in terms of, trying to think of solutions, it's pretty unlikely we'd be able to, get a flatter ramp gradient here, because as you could imagine, this is already quite a long bridge or ramp to get up to the facility or down to the facility. So lengthening that out would just be very, very expensive and also very, very long. So that's probably not going to be too achievable. But could we have a think about, well, maybe we just try and relocate where that conflict point is. So instead of having that intersection, or where those two shared paths connect, can we instead bring the other shared path along here and push it further away, where the sight lines are much better, so you can see any other shared path users that may be accessing that space. And also it's further away from the toe of that ramp. So cyclists would be able to, they won't be traveling at quite as high speeds during that flat section there. Pretty common arrangement though at any of those kind of pedestrian cyclist overpasses. But yeah, just something to think about if you are working within that space. All right. I've got a diagram here. This one is taken out of Bicycle New South Wales, and it is kind of what's seen as the operating width of a cyclist. So similar to how we have operating width of, a general traffic vehicle, we have the operating width of a heavy vehicle. This is what it looks like for a cyclist. There are multiple different versions of this, relatively the same values. There are a few discrepancies, but we've chosen this one to issue. So the first thing to note is the operating width of the bicycle and the rider. It's taken at about 1 meter. So it's about 750 mil for the person actually on the bicycle, and then there's 125 mil clearance either side of them, which is not that much. There is also a note within the Austroads guide that suggests that this operating width should be increased to about 1.5 meters where cyclists are traveling uphill, because cyclists, when they're going uphill, they tend to do this like rocking motion, left, right, just to get a bit of momentum and help them navigate those gradients. So I wouldn't be surprised if, in future editions of Austroads and other guidelines documents, we do see a bit wider operating widths to be playing with. And also, given the fact that these operating widths, they were designed on, what is considered an average bicycle. And I think, as we can all appreciate, there seems to be quite a diversity now on our networks as to what that exactly looks like. So we've got lots of cargo bikes, we've got trikes and tricycles, we've got recumbent bikes and things like that. So lots of different styles of bicycles. So I would imagine that would also play a role in trying to define what this average bicycle looks like. But for the time being, feel free to use this as a reference to help help underpin any decisions that you make within this space. The height kind of restriction. So we think of the height of the cyclists is about 2.2 meters, and then we allow another 200 mil for head clearance. So that's really, really applicable if you've got any tunnels that cyclists need to go through, or they need to go through any underpasses or things like that. That's where that figure comes into play. The other really critical one here is, what do we consider adjacent a cyclist operating with? What width becomes important when we're talking about hazards? Now, hazards could be any kind of fixed object that's within the shared path or adjacent the shared path. It can be things like trees or vegetation. It can be utility poles. It can be fences. It can be bollards. We talk more about bollards later on. The 0.5 meters, which is listed there as desirable, that's generally the rule of thumb. So that's more what you take. So anything that's measured from the edge of the operating width, half a meter away, if there's a fixed object there, that would be considered a hazard. To make things even simpler, generally the way that things are measured is, if you've got a shared path like this, and you just measure off the edge of the shared path half a meter, if there's any fixed objects within that, you'd have a look at, trying to either remove that as a hazard or demarcate around it. And we've got some examples of how you could manage that. But that's generally the rule of thumb. The 0.2 minimum there, that would be more referring to things that are unlikely to cause cyclists to destabilize. So flexible bollards, flexible paddles, or cycle-friendly fencing. And we've got some examples of that as well. Oh, I should have mentioned this last little graph at the bottom here, just to do with the speed of cyclists as well. Generally, if you're talking about shared paths, I would say, a 20-kilometer-hour speed is probably a reasonable assessment. 30 kilometer per hour, they're probably going to be on the road for that kind of thing. But obviously lower speeds as well for any, other users there that don't feel comfortable traveling at that speed. But I'd say 20 kilometers to 25 would be a reasonable assessment of shared paths for cyclists. And the source for that second image is from the Global Designing Cities Initiative. We haven't actually provided that one within our resources package on the LMS. The reason being, the Global Street Design Guides, the way that they have set up is they actually like to see who's downloaded their guidelines. So you have to put in your details and you have to say where you're from. It is obviously an international organization. So it's really, really good though. It's like a 600 page, is that right? No, maybe like 300 page, 600 meg document. It's a really, really big document, but it's completely comprehensive about what everyone around the world is kind of doing within the cycling space and what you can look at for treatments. So strongly encourage you to download that one. Some common hazards that we do see adjacent shared paths can be things like what you could call roadside hazards, but or roadside furniture, sorry. So things like bins. Perfect example of where, if we had to just flipped this pole to go here and create a little bin outstand or bin bay there, that could have helped reduce that as a risk. So that's a common hazard to find. Another one being where the shared path adjacent surface is not level. So you might have this drop-off point. The real quick and easy fix there is just to ensure that all your shared paths are batted up to the surface level and you don't have that drop-off, because if you are riding things with, narrow tires, road bikes, it's just incredibly unlikely you would be able to get back up onto that shared path. You'd be in quite a lot of trouble there. The final one here is there's actually a utility pole right adjacent the edge of this shared path. So as a general rule of thumb, as I'm sure we're all aware, if we've done any risk identification and mitigating measures, things that we want to be looking at is if we can actually remove the risk altogether. So if we can relocate that utility pole or relocate the shared path just to get us away from that hazard. Where that's not, really feasible, you can look at going the next level down, which is trying to delineate or raise awareness of the hazard. Here's an example of how that could be achieved through the use of these flexible paddles or flexible bollards here. So this is a shared path, and as you can see, it has been narrowed here. There's a pinch point because of this gantry column. Once again, in a perfect world, during the development of this particular project, this may have been picked up, an auditor or during the design review process and suggested, well, let's try and push this closer into the batter and build some retaining walls just to keep all that earth back, just to ensure that we can keep the shared path, because putting the paddles there and narrowing the path is certainly not, it's not removing the hazard. It's just making it a little bit more obvious. All right. Quite technical, this slide, and appreciate not everyone may have seen any sightline calculations before. The reason that we include it is just to remind any designers that there are actual sightline requirements and calculations for cyclists. So for those that have had to do sightline calculations, your minimum stopping distance or your stopping sight distance, intersection sight distance, all those kind of things. Generally, that's from the perspective of motorists or heavy vehicles in some instances. There are also separate calculations for cyclists. Very, very similar formulas though. So things you'll be considering, what would be the speed? This is where you can jot down any of your assumptions. So as before, if it was a shared path and it's kind of a flat terrain, you may assume that a 20 kilometer per hour speed there would be a reasonable assumption. You generally always take the worst case scenario being in wet conditions for the coefficient of friction, and the grade of the path needs to get factored in there as well. Not going to go through this whole thing. It's just to throw out there for any designers as a reminder that we do have sightline requirements for cyclists. And this has got to do with the horizontal sightline. So I'll go to the next slide, which will kind of explain why this is important. And if you had a cyclist on the right of the screen there, traveling around a bend or traveling around a corner there, they do need to have adequate sight lines to be able to spot any objects or hazards that may be in their path, and be able to stop in time, basically. Hazards could be, there could be a serious defect in the path, equivalent to a pothole. There could be a log that's fallen over. There could be a cyclist that's fallen over that needs help or attention or something like that. So that's the reason that we perform these sight distance checks, is just to ensure that we're providing that stopping distance. And and just as a real life example here, this is, believe it or not, this is a shared path. It doesn't look like it, but this is sealed. And because of this vegetation here, it's quite difficult, to be able to see around that bend. And if you were traveling at speed and there was a hazard there, it could potentially be hidden by that. So a recommendation here would be to trim back the vegetation just to open up those sight lines. Elsa.
Yes, we have a question about e-bikes. So someone's asked that with the e-bike speeds now being about 25, should we be going for that rather than the 20? That's something you and I have briefly discussed before.
We have speed. Indeed. What's your opinion, Elsa?
It's tricky. I think in share use paths, maybe that would be a good one to consider.
Yeah.
Two-way especially.
Yeah, I think generally where you do have lots of e-bikes, yeah, you would see them taking that upper limit or going to, you know, what would legally be able to travel at. So I would agree if you're seeing those users within the space to perhaps go for the higher limit there, which will impact things like these sightlines, how much sightline distance you need to be able to provide them. Let's give a prize out there. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Alrighty, we'll get stuck into fencing now. And once again, there are specific requirements as to when you should be installing fences. One is to do with what is the adjacent drop-off. So if it's like a really big fall or a really small fall, how can we manage that? The other one is to do with the steepness of the batter. So if it's like a cliff face that you're riding against, that's probably going to need a fence. But if it's just a very flat land, then obviously no fence required. So just to run you through this, just so you've got a bit of an idea of how this works, there's two kind of categories of fencing, which in my personal opinion, I think is overly complicating this topic. But they've got this idea of a partial barrier fence and a full barrier fence. I'll show you exactly what those two examples mean in a second. But if we look at the left-hand diagram here, we've got this note of X. X is the distance from the edge of the shared path to where the vertical drop is situated. And then we've got the dimension Y. And Y is just what is the vertical fall? What is the drop? So we can see in the first scenario here, if X is less than 2 meters and Y is less than 250 mil, it's saying a fence is not required, with the asterisk saying instead what you want to do is batter off the surface. So instead, just get some fill material and fill that in. Don't worry about a fence, just fill that in. Okay, pretty pragmatic solution there. Where we do have greater falls or greater vertical drops, between 250 mil to 2 meters, and 2 meters is a huge fall. That's where the suggestion of the partial barrier fence is, and anything above that is the full barrier fence. Similar kind of philosophy for the steepness of the batter here. For those that have done any of your batter gradients, you'd be familiar with the 1 to Z concept, or, you know, rise over run, going back to our linear relationships. And basically all this is saying is if you've got a nice flat surface or anything that's greater than 8, then yeah, don't worry about putting in a fence because it's likely to be flat enough. If a cyclist were to veer off the edge of the path, they'd be able to, you know, stabilize and hopefully get back on. But anything greater than that, depending on the steepness, you'll either require partial or a full barrier fence. Now, the differences between those, the one on the top has just got horizontal bars. Obviously, it's got the vertical props just to help with construction, but the horizontal bars are the primary means to, you know, capture any meandering cyclists there. That's a partial barrier fence. The full barrier fence has got vertical members all the way through. So it's virtually impossible to be able to obviously fall through that. You could theoretically fall over that still, but it hasn't got those windows where theoretically, you know, a toddler or a small child could fall through. As I said, I personally think it's overcomplicating things, but that's the two definitions or the two tiers that we have for the cyclist fencing. The most critical feature, if you are doing any fencing adjacent shared paths, is to ensure that you've got this smooth rail. And you can see it is clearly shown in both of those cross sections. And the smooth rail is shown in both of those images there. That smooth rail, smooth deflection rail, is intentionally situated about 1.2 meters to 1.5 meters, which is roughly a cyclist's elbow to their shoulder. So as you're riding along, if you were to become errant and strike this fence, your shoulder to your elbow, that's the part that's going to hit it, not your handlebar and not kind of your wrist that could then get snagged on any members. So it's deliberately designed at that height to maximize the chances of a cyclist staying on their bike and, you know, hopefully continuing to ride along, as opposed to getting snagged on any vertical members or losing control and stability. So that's often referred to as cycle-friendly fencing, but it's just this idea of one smooth, continuous rail that juts out. Ilsa.
So Ken has asked, how about behind that drop? Is curb adjacent to the road where filling it up or batter is not possible? Is a fence still required? What do you
How
think?
about behind that drop, 0.25 meters or less? Is a curb adjacent to the road where filling it up? Oh, is the fence still required? Oh, okay, so you're unable to do the fill, and you've still got a, yeah, okay. So you've got like a shared path here, and then a drop, and then like a curb, and then the carriageway, something like this. And that's 250 or less. So you're not able to actually fill that. Would it be possible to do, rather than granular fill, to do a concrete infill, like an asphalt or a concrete in there like that, like boxing all of this up and fill that in? Because that could be an option. Otherwise, yeah, you could be looking at putting in a cycle-friendly fence on that side. I'd have to kind of look at the details to maybe provide a bit more advice there.
Thanks.
I can see just another question that came through, entry and exit displays of fencing, which is a very good idea. So for those not familiar with that term, if you are on a shared path, just try and draw a nice straight one like this, and you had a fence that was relatively close to the edge of the shared path there, if you kind of deliberately put it parallel to start with, it can have this effect for cyclists where if you're riding up here, you actually want to kind of veer away from it. It's the term that's used within the road design context is the shy line effect. So barrier systems on roads tend to have this splay as well. So it's the same kind of principle here, where you would kind of provide a splay or, you know, angle the start or end of the fence treatment off a bit, so cyclists don't feel the need to kind of veer out of their lane or veer away from that feature and potentially encroach into other spaces. So yes, that's a very good consideration. Let's give a prize out to Thomas there with that one. And yes, I can see the sign in the bottom photo isn't in a great spot. Yes, I agree with you, Craig. Good pickup. I was going to mention that. This sign here is very interestingly installed on the shared path side of things. So theoretically, if you were riding and collided with this fence and you were, you know, engaged with the smooth deflection rail and you were kind of being run along this rail, you're going to collide straight into that sign. So that is not a great positioning. Instead, any of that furniture, all the signs and things, put them on the other side of the fence. So you don't have that, you know, basically careening you straight into another hazard. So good pickup there, Craig. Prize there for Craig. I'll go through this last slide and then we'll pause for a break. Okay? So last little point on fencing. So we've already talked about longitudinal fencing. We want to make sure that we've got, you know, smooth rails and things like that. We don't want to be using any fences that kind of curve towards the rider or any sharp points. There are examples where they curve outwards. It can be a nice kind of architectural feature. For those that do curve outwards, the need for a smooth deflection rail isn't quite as significant because it's less likely that you're actually going to strike that. But the TMR have got some information on that if you are after a bit more detail as to when to apply specific fence types. There's a lot of information in the TMR document. And the other example that I just wanted to mention is low fences as well. So things like planter boxes is a really common one. They can actually be a hazard for a cyclist's pedals. So kind of the 200 mil mark, anything above that, is considered a pedaling hazard, and that can, cause a cyclist to once again lose balance or become destabilized. So something to also consider. Anything within that space could be deemed a hazard. I'm going to pause here, and let's say we'll give it 5 minutes where you can go get a coffee, have a cup of tea, have a stretch, do whatever you'd like to do. And my clock says 2:01. Just in 5 minutes time, if we can come back in, we'll continue module 1. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a nice stretch and had time to get a tea or a coffee and a snack. Marissa, if we can launch the next poll, I just wanted to check in with the group and ask a question about this particular site that you can see. No, sorry, I think that's the next poll, next module. There we go. So I've got a question for the group. Should fencing be installed along this shared path? Now, just to do a little diagram of what I'm talking about here, I'm saying, do you reckon we should put a fence at the edge of this shared path to protect cyclists, errant cyclists? So there's no, we're not actually marking you on these poll questions, so don't be stressed if you're umming and ahhing about which one to go for. It's just a little snapshot question just to see how everyone's finding the content. So should fencing be installed along the shared path? I'll give you another 20 seconds to go for that one. Might draw another smooth deflection rail there. So this is an interesting example, this shared path, as it is located within the median of a kind of divided carriageway. It's an arterial road. And to make things even more complicated, there are tram lines or light rail located adjacent the traffic as well. So you can kind of see it just there, and there's one there as well. So this is just smack bang right in the middle, just making the most of this kind of reserve that was located, that was originally planned. It's kind of a tree-lined area that's now just been used as a beautiful shared path all the way through. We might just end the poll there, Marissa, and we can share the results with everyone. Okay, so we've had an overwhelming portion of the group saying that no, we don't require the fence there, and I think that's probably a pretty reasonable assessment. For those that said yes, we should be putting a fence there, well, you might have been asking, well, how far away are these hazards? You might have been thinking that's probably closer than that 0.5 meter that I spoke about before, so maybe we do require a fence to protect errant cyclists, so that's where that may have come from. But generally, when you're thinking of fences, think of them as any other kind of roadside furniture. And is it necessary? Is it going to clutter the area? Is it going to create a hazard in itself? The other thing with fencing is, it does create this tunnel effect. And if cyclists needed to get off the shared path and there is no safe way to leave that, so that could do with personal safety and things like that. That's just one of the other factors that you can think of within this space. Just a general thought there. What I wanted to actually focus on for this photo here is how the shared path actually crosses over the road. So as I mentioned, this is kind of within the median However, vehicles are required to cross over this shared path. So this is the area here, you can kind of see. And the way that this particular example is managed is shared path users, they have the priority. So they have right of way. They're not forced to slow down, stop, give way, whatever it is, look for oncoming vehicles. This is their kind of thoroughfare, and they can cycle straight through here. Motorists, on the other hand, they do have to slow down, stop, give way to cyclists or pedestrians using this space before crossing over. The way that that is actually configured in this example is it's a raised table. So this is raised to the shared path level. The raised feature has, numerous benefits. One being it physically slows down motorists. So if you put a speed hump on a road, that's going to slow down a car. Similar, if you put a raised table where the conflict point is, you're ensuring that vehicle speeds are lower. And it also just provides that clarity around who gets the priority here. Well, the raised shared path users are assigned that priority. A couple more examples of how that raised shared path priority can be managed. And we do consider this best practice. So whenever we do have shared paths crossing over carriageways, if you are able to raise it and you give priority to pedestrians and cyclists, we do consider that as best practice. So not only the safety benefit, as I mentioned before, slowing vehicles down, but also the continuity for cyclists. It just becomes a much more attractive feature if cyclists are able to maintain their speed. They don't have to worry about, slowing down, looking for cars and things like that, particularly if they are dotted at very regular intervals. It can be very, very strenuous for a cyclist to have to continually slow down and then speed up. It's a lot easier to be able to decelerate and accelerate in a car because there's no actual physical labor involved with that. I do have these two examples here. So example one on the left here is where a shared path, is raised and crossing over the road environment. You can see there is the sign there, give way to pedestrians and cyclists. Slightly different arrangement here, but it's got the same philosophy of raising the shared path, giving the priority to pedestrians and cyclists. My preferred arrangement is this example shown on the left, and I'll throw it out to the group if you can think of why I would prefer what is shown on the left there as opposed to the right. So the left one is in Melbourne, along a very, very popular cycling trail, and the right one is the Bicentennial Bicycle Way up in Brisbane. Any ideas why I would prefer the example shown on the left there?
I think maybe Thomas got a great answer. Observation angle for drivers.
I think there might have been a question. Oh no, you've answered that in the chat there, sorry, in the Q&A.
And the give way could be confusing for some cyclists.
Yeah.
They might think that it's theirs for them. On the right side, straight path on the left, good sight lines. Cycling has brighter colors on the left to increase visibility. Good visibility on the left side. A lot of sightline answers.
Oh, that's good. All very valid issues. And I saw one question that came through just regarding the colors of things. Yes, it is a bit annoying that different jurisdictions do colored pavement differently. I am very much a fan of trying to harmonize all of these types of things, but as you can imagine, groups like Ostroads, they try to get all the different jurisdictions together and agree on what is, the best way to go about things. And all the jurisdictions would suggest that their way is the best way. And obviously they don't want to have to alter any of their current network. So that's where we kind of get these little divergence. So the color of things aren't my greatest concern in these examples, because as long as it's communicating to motorists, local motorists in that area, and they're aware of what that means, probably doing a good job. However, what I did want to mention was, so that sightline issue, or the angle on which cyclists are crossing there, is not really ideal. So in the left-hand example, the crossing angle there is perpendicular. So the ability for a cyclist to make eye contact with a vehicle that could be approaching that intersection or that roundabout, it's a lot easier to be able to see one another. It's a lot easier for the motorist as well to be able to see any cyclists in that perpendicular environment. If you could imagine, if you were riding in the right-hand example and a vehicle was also traveling in the same parallel path direction, they may not necessarily, appreciate that you're about to kind of cut in front of them and go across them. So that's one aspect, the cognitive work to do with that. But also, just if you were that cyclist and trying to turn to your right and look over your shoulder and try and spot any motorists that may be traveling at speed and potentially going to ignore the give way sign, it's just really, really hard to do that. So perpendicular crossings where possible, much more attractive. And I appreciate there were lots of site constraints with the Bicentennial Bikeway, so I'm not trying to say that this is a terrible example or anything like that, but just wanted to demonstrate how those angle changes do affect the safety for cyclists. Now, this is what this particular crossing point looks like out on site, and you may notice that around that kind of conflict point, you do have lots of this skid marks or braking. So it kind of tells the story that perhaps cyclists are slamming on the brakes at this location because perhaps motorists are traveling through there without giving way. Or maybe the curve of the radius is too tight and it's not appropriate, or, whatever reason. But I think that kind of illustrates the point where if you are able to provide one continuous passage for cyclists all in the same direction, it's just a much more comfortable ride. Ilsa?
I think a good question came in. Do you think that there's any risk that vehicles might confuse the path on the right and maybe veer into that area because it is so flush with a flat top?
That's a very good point. Yeah, let's give a prize out there. That's something that I think would get picked up within a road safety audit, where you have to kind of consider all of the risks associated with these features. So you'd be thinking about it from the cyclist perspective, from the driver's perspective, and yeah, that risk there of a motorist potentially being like, where does my path go? Do I diverge there, or am I continuing straight there? That it's certainly a possibility. A lot of the ways that we tend to see that mitigated is through the use of bollards, but that has its own issues as well.
And also, are you aware of any specific warrants for raised crossings?
So a lot of jurisdictions are actually moving away from this idea of warrants, in the fact that historically we've become, as engineers, we have become quite addicted to the idea that you need X amount of pedestrians or X amount of cyclists in order to achieve best practice, which would be a raised crossing point.
Yeah, I think also maybe in areas where you're trying to plan ahead, warrants might not be currently being met, but in the future will likely be met. So warrants aren't always very helpful.
Absolutely. That's exactly right, Elsa. Yeah. So instead we try and just really inject that what we do know from a safe system thinking. We've signed up to the safe system framework, you know, at a national level, at a jurisdiction level. We've got this idea that we want to aim towards zero deaths and serious injury on our transport network. So this idea that we need to have a certain amount of cyclists that pass through a particular area before we can actually invest in infrastructure that's really going to help save their lives is a little bit obsolete in terms of that thinking. Appreciate, you know, if you're comparing an inner city example versus a regional township, there's obviously investment scenarios there where you'd look at things like BCRs and how those can get approved. But in terms of developing your specific projects, I think it is just good practice to step away from that idea of just sole numbers of cyclists.
Just a follow-up on that, someone was asking about MOAs and if in the future you think that they will still be needed. And that's, I think, something we've also talked about. And I think maybe because they are changing the priority legally, I think they will likely still be needed, but maybe the process might become easier as they become more common.
So for those not familiar, the MOA, the Memorandum of Agreement, hopefully I've got that right. So within Victoria, and I'm sure within lots of other states, wherever you are planning on implementing any signage that alters road rules, you need to get one of these MOAs from the state road authority, so from Vic Roads or DTP in this instance. And because the the crossing point itself, if it's got a zebra crossing or it's being demarcated as priority zone for vulnerable road users, it does require that MOA to occur. I haven't heard any talk of that kind of being pushed to the responsibility of LGAs, so I can't really give you too much insight there, but I think that's just kind of the process that we've got in place at the moment. Yeah. Memorandum of authorization. Apologies. Thank you, Thomas. What about using the existing site conditions as factors for warrants such as 85 percentile speed, nearby amenities? I think, once again, I like the idea of using them as considerations. So thinking about, you know, what is the local road environment? What's the local context? Providing all of that in an objective sense. So just collating all of that information that is known, but not necessarily saying that, you know, if it's 10% above the posted speed limit, then it requires X level of intervention, or 15%, it requires this level of investment. Yeah, I'm not quite sure that we as an industry seem to be stepping away from that that way of thinking. And just for the question there from Mohammed, not understanding the idea of these warrants, it's basically like setting specific metrics around, it could be around whatever. So it could be, if you've got 100 cyclists crossing here per day, then give them a at-grade crossing of the road. If it's above 100, so say you've got 101, then you can give them a raised crossing point. So that's the idea of these warrants, where it's actually specific metrics where engineers or designers can refer to that and be like, okay, that's the treatment that I need to do. But as I said, we're kind of stepping away from that and going back to a principle approach and trying to get, you know, what's going to be the best outcome for our community. Okay, now I did mention that we will talk about bollards, and there's lots of different ideas around how these look and feel. Probably the most common are just, you know, upright fixed objects. They tend to be at the, you know, in the middle of our shared paths, adjacent carriageways. So the idea of them is obviously to deter any vehicle entry to the shared path itself, which is a completely, you know, understandable objective, you don't want vehicles to be traveling on the shared path. However, you've got to have a think about your risk levels for actually having that event occur versus the risk level of a cyclist striking that feature, because they're both relevant risks. And just as we categorize any risks that we do on a network, we need to be objective. We need to, take account of what are the factors associated with this example versus this example, or these two scenarios. What can I do to help mitigate it? And if you think of it objectively like that, I think there's multiple examples on our network where we kind of just default to putting bollards on our shared path network when they probably don't need to be there, because the risk of vehicle entry is extraordinarily low. An example of that is this middle diagram, or this middle photo that I've taken here, where we've got bollards, and it's obviously you cannot tell where this is contextually, but it is well and truly off-road. There's no carriageway near this at all. From my understanding, these have been installed purely for rubbish collection vehicles, so they don't progress any further. They may be accessing the adjacent esplanade kind of area, but don't want them traveling any further. I think that's a real example where instead of implementing these fixed hazards that, this particular example, very difficult for cyclists to see, it blends in with the surrounding environment. Instead of going for that approach, could we instead ensure that we have all contractors, we approve all their swims, and they have either a map to show exactly where their route is, where they are not allowed to travel beyond? Could we geofence the area so physically they are unable to travel any further than, this point here or something like that, or use some other means to demarcate that? Because I think a really good way to think about these hazards is the bollards. If you were to install them in a traffic lane, no way, obviously you couldn't, okay? And yet it seems absolutely part of the mainstream, or it's just common practice to install these at the end of shared paths, bike paths, and it's just accepted that that's what we do. Anyway, I just wanted to really iterate the point there that you should be having a very strategic think about these things and really consider if they are required at all. Ilsa.
Do you know of a minimum distance between bollards if you are intending them to stop vehicles from accessing paths?
Not at the top of my head. I'll welcome any designers that may know the operating width of a vehicle. Feel free to chuck that in the chat. But yeah, I can have a look at that figure. I'm sure we'll have that. But there are some. Oh, sorry.
Oh, similarly, just if the banana bars were used to stop vehicles, or is that mostly used just to highlight a crossing?
Yeah, I think the banana bars, which is this example on the right here, that was kind of a little bit of both, stopping vehicles and just really trying to highlight that spot. But pretty sure that those treatments are no longer being installed. They're being ripped out kind of across Queensland just because they're pinching cyclists in at this conflict point here. And yeah, it looks like that 1.5 meter is being used there in between the bollards there. I have seen much tighter being used though, and that's probably an example of one where the intent is they don't want mini bike riders or monkey bike riders or whatever they're called, motorbike riders. They don't want them to access the shared path, so they've really tightened that up even further. Coincidentally, that 1.5 meter, remember that actually is our operating width for a cyclist as well. A few more examples of our bollards there. Timber bollards, you can have these chicane treatments, which I think can also be quite effective. They do certainly slow down cyclists, where if you've got a significant hazard, if they're approaching an arterial road, for instance, that can be a good way of doing things. I've seen a lot of these chicanes though, where the actual design path may cater for general cyclists, but any of those larger bicycles, so cargo bikes, or if you've got a bicycle trailer, so you've got a little kid in the back, or you've got a little dog in your back, anything like that, those chicane treatments can actually not be wide enough to enable movement through for any of those longer cyclists. So something to be mindful of. This last example is in Hobart, where it's kind of this idea of just putting up a little hazard board for cyclists as they're entering the CBD along this shared trail here. Once again, I have that same theory where you would never do that for general traffic, where you just kind of close off their lane and just say, hey, be careful, you're approaching something more significant now. Like, we've got to start thinking of other solutions. And one example that I will hop into in a minute actually, of what you could do instead, but I'll talk about like why this is, I suppose, so relevant. This is a bollard installed on the bike line that Ilse just mentioned at the start of today's module, the upfield bike line. And on the left-hand side is what it looked like when this fellow here collided with it. So he rode straight into it and came off his bike and had some facial injuries and broken wrist and things like that. And then council came out the next day and they gave it a little bit of a facelift and gave it some spray paint and some fresh delineated tape. But this fellow here, yes, so he was injured on the ground, waiting for the ambulance to arrive to get taken to hospital. And within that 40-minute period for an ambulance to come, he witnessed 2 other riders hit that same bollard. So whilst we have a record of this particular individual attending an hospital to get, treatment for his injuries associated with that infrastructure, the 2 other cyclists we do not have any records of, because cyclist injuries are incredibly underreported. Cyclists don't know if they are able to report that. They don't know who to talk to. And bollards is actually one of the things that a lot of cyclists can talk to and test to of actually striking. And you may be thinking, for those that are not cyclists or, really within their space, like, it's a giant hazard. How could you miss that? Well, a lot of the time when these shared path networks get busy, you could just be following a cyclist in front of you, and the cyclist in front of you can completely block a bollard. So potentially they could be running, riding straight into a bollard and then veer out at the last second. And you may have no idea what's going on. And then in a split second, you're colliding into something like this. So I just wanted to say that it is a very, very common injury type to happen and something that is incredibly underreported. So just be mindful of that. Okay, so what could we do instead of our bollards? Well, similar to how we kind of treat our road network. So if we go back to our road transport engineering, traffic engineering design toolkit, something that kind of pops up that might be familiar is this idea of a splitter island. And we could also look to implement splitter islands where we have shared paths approaching any of our roads. You could, of course, use concrete curbing and infill materials, or you could use vegetation, landscaping. You could use a bollard within that space there, assuming that it's got adequate clearance from the edge of the bicycle lane there, just to help deter any entry of motor vehicles. But this solution here, which is taken out of the Austroads guide, I think is a much more elegant solution, as opposed to just putting in a bollard because it's quick and easy and you don't have to worry about it. But this idea of using some landscaping, make it a little bit nicer, and it also helps emphasize to cyclists that there is a change in their path conditions. They're approaching a road, they need to be aware of that. So much more in favor of something that looks like this. Here's a kind of example of this in practice, where these 3 bollards have been implemented in a splitter island of sorts. It's kind of in a grassed verge. The idea is to deter vehicles entering the bridge here. Once again, if a vehicle wanted to do that, I'm sure that they could, but helping to deter that movement. And the thing that I like about this particular example, though, is those bollards actually got solar panels on the top of them, and the bottom of them light up at night. So they become very, very visible and help to demarcate that area during low light conditions. Okay, I wanted to just articulate a final point on the shared paths where we are crossing roads, that we still are required to think about our DDA requirements. So for those not familiar, the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, it's an acknowledgement that people with disabilities, people with mobility issues, or vision impairments or anything like that, they do require additional features to help them understand they're approaching a carriageway. All of those features are still applicable and relevant with the raised crossings that we've shown. So the tactile ground surface indicators may need to be installed on the footpath where the bicycle path has priority to comply with the DDA Act. So that is still a requirement. For those unfamiliar with the tactile ground surface indicators, it's just those little kind of braille dots that you see adjacent a vehicle crossing. So people with vision impairments are able to, get a sense that they're approaching a carriageway. So yes, something to be mindful of. And okay, I'll move on to our next section, which is shared paths crossing over shared paths. So before we add shared paths crossing over roads, but I did want to ask the group, what do you think is wrong with this photo? So I've got a very confused looking cyclist there, and any idea why this cyclist might be confused? I'll get the cyclist out of the way. You can have a bit of a think about what I'm trying to get at with this question. So what's wrong with this photo?
Lots of giveaway answers coming through. Wayfinding signs are not present. Priority for who has right of way. Wayfinding, right of way, keep left. I think the majority answer is right of way.
Very good.
There's no lighting as well. That's a good answer. Lighting. No signage.
Right. Well, we're certainly getting very similar themes there, and I agree with all the comments that have come through. We'll give a prize out, Ilse, there. Whoever first said the priority. I think, yes, the priority issue is quite significant.
That is Thomas.
Well done, Thomas. So just for those not certain what I'm talking about there, those hands are doing it again to me. Alrighty. So the priority would be, just ensuring, just like at any T intersection or Y intersection or anything like that, for general traffic, it's abundantly clear which is the thoroughfare and which is the minor leg. This example, there's no such clarification. So what you want to ensure is if you've got any of these Y intersections, well, it's the first thing, good practice is to square them up. So make them perpendicular, open up sight lines, things like that, and also assign a priority leg. So let's just say that this is the priority leg. You could look at, deviating the path so it comes out here instead. Putting I drew that on the wrong side. Putting a little stop line there or a give way line there or something like that, just so it's really clear. All right, the traffic on the left there, you've got right of way. And if you're coming in from the other side, then you have to pause, give way before entering there. So you want to make that as clear as possible. So definitely agree with that. And the other suggestion that I can see came through quite a bit was the lack of signage, the lack of directional or wayfinding signage, which may sound quite negligible and, you know, quite petty or something like that, but it actually makes a big difference for the connectivity and how attractive a cyclist facility feels. And this is an actual example there of where I was riding in this facility and I didn't know which way to go. So I had to get off my bike, check my phone. Luckily, I had my phone on me just to see if I was meant to take the left or the right leg because I had no idea. And it's just irritating to have that. Just like we, label all our streets with names, we could have a sign here to say left is to go to the library and the right is to continue on this beautiful creek trail. Ilsa.
Yeah, a really unique answer came through, I think. What about a small roundabout? Would that fix the problem?
Oh, okay. We do have a slide a little bit later on. Yes, is it in today's? No, it's in the next module. A small roundabout. Okay, so that's an interesting suggestion. And we'll give a prize out there. I have personally not seen it. I would welcome anyone in the comment if you have seen a roundabout purely for cyclists. I'm not sure how well received that would be, particularly for cyclists that want to turn right, because I think it would be incredibly common to cut the corner or to go against the circulating area and just use the most convenient movements, which would really impact the effectiveness of it. But yeah, I'm open to the group. If you do know examples of a roundabout that's been installed for cyclists, I'd be very
Apparently Canadians do it, so
Canadians do it.
You can check that out.
Yeah, I'm actually heading to Canada Friday week, so who knows? Maybe I'll be changing my tune in a matter of weeks. But in saying that, yeah, within our context, no, I haven't seen that as an example, but something that could be looked at. So, did want to have a quick conversation around the wayfinding signage. Austroads has released a research report on bicycle wayfinding. And in my opinion, if there's ever some kind of jurisdiction or I don't think of what Austroads is consider themselves, but like someone that presents guidelines or anything like that, like that's their job. And they have nominated, I'm going to invest time and money and resources to develop a specific document about bicycle wayfinding. The fact that they have nominated to actually invest all that time and money and resources kind of illustrates that, it's a pretty significant topic that needs to be addressed, because the way that we do it in Australia is really, really dependent on where you are across the nation. So we don't have one homogenized, demarcation or street signage or, the way that we actually deal with this issue. Instead, it is very much taken on an LGA basis, which is not necessarily, the end of the world. All you've got to just be communicating is, particularly if cyclists are on the same corridor, you just want to make sure all of those signs look consistent. All of the information that's being conveyed is, legible. It's easy for them to read. If they're following a sign that tells them that they're going towards a library at each intersection, that's also being reinforced. It's just these basic principles that are really demonstrated in this research report, and yet it is something that's we're not the best at within Australia. So I just took this one example where, we can see specific destinations for cyclists. The way that it's demarcated is using the blue coloring, which is different to those other signs there, as well as the bicycle symbol. and also displaying the distance. So 5.0 obviously means 5 kilometers. I've seen others where you actually show how long it takes to ride there. So perhaps that's a 10-minute ride or a 12-minute ride or whatever it is like that. Once again, it's just consistency, just making sure it's all got the same look and feel along the corridor, I think would be a big improvement. So just to show you how things are done in other places of the world, the left-hand photo here is in Copenhagen, it's in Denmark, where if you are taking route number 2, you know that that goes from the central station all the way to the city square. So you can be a tourist, not understand a word of the language. And if you just follow number 2, you know where you are going to go, which I think is just phenomenal. And I think it's something that we should be trying to communicate as well, as easy as that. The example on the right there, similar thinking there. This is in the Netherlands. Got a lot more routes at this particular junction. And they also provide a map, you know, where are you in relation to specific sites and things like that. So I've, just wanted to bring that in for a little bit of discussion there. Something that's often overlooked, but something that we should be, you know, remembering as part of the design process, how cyclists are going to be able to navigate their way around different shared paths. Oh no, I did include this. I thought this was the next module. Okay, so this is an example in Perth, adjacent a train station. It's City West Station for those out in WA today. And we've got here a shared path that is approaching a very, very busy pedestrian area. So this is just adjacent, kind of that boom gate area where pedestrians will just flood this area and then walk up towards the train station, and that's obviously where they access their services. But this particular area gets incredibly busy, incredibly concentrated levels of pedestrian traffic. So what the designers opted to do, rather than just treat this as like a shared path that just happens to go through here and, you know, it's a shared path, so pedestrians are meant to be there. Like they thought, no, we acknowledge that we've got significant volumes of pedestrians. Cyclists may not be expecting that. So let's try and communicate that to them through the infrastructure. And this is where we've got things like our splitter islands. So once again, similar to what we're thinking with our traffic engineering, it's just been applied to cycling. We've got green colouring, we've got give way stenciled in there as well. So cyclists know, hey, something's going on here. There's something a little bit different. We've got this curbing here as well. It's got the kind of chevron arrows. All of this is communicating to cyclists that there's a change coming here, something different about this shared path here. I think this is one way to have gone about it. And I'm opening up to the chat if you could think of any other interventions that could have potentially been implemented at this site to help communicate to cyclists that they are approaching a pedestrianized space.
Do you have some guesses already coming in before you even asked? Someone has suggested raising the pedestrian crossing, perhaps including some zebra line marking. Zebra line marking, maybe putting the giveaway sign a bit further back to give a bit more of an advanced warning. Yep, zebra line marking. Yeah, grade separation. Change in pavement, maybe putting some brick in to distinguish the crossing
very good,
better.
yeah.
And a bit of a speed hump.
You would probably have a similar issue on your upfield bike path rides, Ilsa?
With crossing pedestrians?
Yeah.
Yes, there's there's a few areas where there's really poor sight lines, and usually people just ding really loud their bell.
Yeah, okay. that's
and
the solution.
make sure that the pedestrian stops, and that is
everyone gets a loud bell.
Yes, pretty much. Not great.
Yeah, I think there's some really good treatments there. So that's really exciting. See, and a lot of these cycling interventions, you can see how they certainly do stem from that traffic engineering space. So we're just scaling things down and applying within this space. The prize I'd like to give out there is the suggestion of raising that section. So similar to how we spoke about where cyclists are crossing roads and they've got priority, we raise the shared path. So they've got one continuous movement and we're forcing vehicles to slow down. We can take that philosophy and apply it here as well. And instead we're saying, no, let's give pedestrians priority. Let's raise up the pedestrian section, force cyclists to slow this down. So provide a ramp, like a speed hump or something like that. Once again, giving much more clear visual cues that pedestrians in this area have priority and cyclists, you need to slow down. Because the thing with all of these little symbols and things like that on the ground, another example of that is something that's like this, these little pavement markings. They can be seen within a snapshot of time to cyclists. They're very difficult to be able to spot, 20 meters away. It's basically only when you're right on top of them that you see something that says give way or slow down or anything like that. And even give way signage, once again, obviously that's does to some extent help communicate to cyclists, what the intent of that is, but it is not uncommon for cyclists not to see that signage because they could be focused on other hazards around them. They could be focused on cyclists on the shared path or other shared path users. So things like that can be mixed. If you were to provide vertical deflection, a ramp of some degree, something that physically slows down cyclists, then even if cyclists miss the signs, they're going to be slowed down, which is probably going to alert them that this is a change in space. So yeah, just another solution. I'm not trying to detract from this particular infrastructure, just wanted to show it as an example. That is the end of today's slides. Now, I was going to run through the LMS, but I'll just touch on this final example just as we're ending today. Talk about the ending of a shared path and what not to do. It is certainly more advanced than just putting up a shared path end sign. You really need to think about, am I connecting cyclists to where they want to go? Am I perhaps leading them to an area where it's going to create issues for them? This is adjacent an incredibly busy arterial road to arterial road intersection. And for cyclists that do want to continue their journey, there's no facilities now for them to do so. And as you can appreciate, just because you put up the end sign does not mean a cyclist is going to end their journey. So they may, choose to ride up the verge here. They may choose to enter the carriageway, all these types of things. So it's very important that we consider the strategic nature of our cycling shared paths. Are they connecting A to B? Where are cyclists, likely wanting to travel, and how can we safely terminate these things? So perhaps rather than ending it here, ending it at another location where it could connect to a local bicycle network and then filter through that system instead of getting to this really precarious situation here. To be fair, it probably has been left to future investment in the future, but anyway. I just wanted to go through the LMS. So this is our learning management system. Marissa, did you want to run through it, or are you happy for me to just do it?
Yeah, up to you.
Yeah, I think I'll just do it. I've got to keep going. Introductions. So if you want to say hello to any of your peers and other participants, please just jot down some, brief introduction of who you are, where you're from, and your level of experience within this space. Welcome any photos of you as well. That'd be great. All the resources were saved in this little tab here. So all the course information, all the reference documents that we show within the slides. So all the Ostroad stuff, yeah, all the different guideline documents and things like that are saved within there. We also have, as I mentioned, the Global Designing Cities Initiative. We don't save that resource. Click on that link. You can download it yourself. If there's any resources that you would like to share with other participants, we've provided this tab. So if there's any particular academic research that you're aware of or any jurisdictional guidelines that you think are relevant, you can just drop the files in there. Today's module was all about off-road cycling. We've got the module 1 presentation slides in a PDF, which is there. We've got this link here, which actually takes you to a 360-degree video. So we're going to ask that you do watch this before our next session, which is on Thursday. And what this is, it is a video. If you're on your phone, you can kind of move the phone around and it'll go into a 360-degree view. You can also just click and drag your mouse and it will take you a full perspective of all of your surrounds there. So similar to Google Street View. And there's Ken and myself having a bit of a yarn. And you'll actually get to see what it's like riding through different environments. Okay. So for those using their computer, just remember you can use the mouse just to scroll around and have a look. So we will get you to probably, if you've got time after today's session, just get straight into that video. It's only 6 minutes or something like that. And we'll also get you to complete the quiz. So the module 1 quiz, you can click on that. You can attempt the quiz now. As I mentioned, there's 3 attempts to get stuck into that. But if you're having any questions or difficulties with that, please just reach out. Anything that I missed on the LMS there, Marissa?
No, I think you've covered everything. We do have someone that's querying. If you could go back to the, sorry, if you could share your screen again, Max, and just go back into the introductions. Someone's just said that they couldn't see a spot on where to write. So if we could just show how to pop something in there. Oh, we don't have it either. Okay. All right, let me just fix that one up, but there should be a little
yeah, there's usually a section down here, isn't there, that says
you can add in
yeah,
that's right. So let me just work on that behind the scenes. There might be just a little IT setting that's gone astray there, so I'll just fix it up behind the scenes and you'll be able to pop in something there.
No worries. Oh well. We did leave you a little bit of time at the end of the session just to get stuck into that quiz, get stuck into the 360-degree video. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday. If you rock up just a few minutes earlier, we will be doing trivia. So that's a chance to win some prizes as well.
Yes, we've got plenty of prizes to give away. So tune in a couple minutes early.
That's it. Yes. Terrific. Have a lovely day. Thanks for joining. Thanks for all the great questions. And
thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.